name is Beck and welcome to a video where I talk about the best books that I've ever read according to Goodreads. I got this video idea off Reagan from Peruse Project. I really liked it on her channel. I've probably got a few crossover things based on what she talked about, but I wanted to jump into my list anyway, so let's get started. So what I did here is I essentially went onto my Goodreads and I looked at my read shelf, which is, according to these notes, 658 around there books that I've read, and I looked at all of those and I sorted them based on the highest rated, and I looked at what Goodreads had high ratings of compared to whether I gave it a high rating as well. So some of the books that were on that list were sequels and some of them were the first in series, so I want to focus on the first in series rather than sequels, because if people like the sequel, obviously the first book is going to rate high as well. So I wanted to kind of skip over the sequels and just go with the first books. But some of the sequels that were mentioned were Words of Radiance, which is one of Reagan's favorites, but I love Brandon Sanderson and Stormlight is one of my favorite series ever. So there was Words of Radiance. There was also Fruits Basket, some of the volumes of that contemporary / supernatural manga, and that's an old nostalgic one for me, which I really love. Then there were Heartstopper, which is volume 4, that was highly rated, but as everyone knows, I'm a Heartstopper massive fan, so naturally all of those volumes hit 5 stars for me. We've also got on there Saga volume 9, and everyone was probably scarred from when the authors went on a hiatus and just kind of left the series hanging, so everyone is giving massively high ratings, so volume 9, I would agree with that one. We've also surprisingly got A Court of Mist and Fury, and if you know my channel, you know that I'm not really a Sarah J Maas person, but I read A Court of Thorns and Roses, gave it 2 stars, and then for some reason I continued reading, and then I ended up actually quite enjoying the sequel, but because of all of the fanfare around her work, I know that I'm not going to like it just based on the reviews I've seen. I know it's not my thing anymore. I did like that sequel. I hated the first book. I'm not going to continue, but I liked A Court of Mist and Fury, and that's got quite a high rating as well. And then the other few that have got high ratings are various volumes of Attack on Titan, because that is a apocalyptic fantasy manga. And then there's Morningstar, which is the 3rd book in the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. Loved that book. And then Changes. Of course, Changes is on there by Jim Butcher, which is one of the quintessential Dresden books, number 12 in the series, so held in high regard by me. But now let's get into the books that actually were on the Goodreads list that I might not have agreed with always. So the first one on there I definitely agreed with was Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Overall, it got a 4.79 rating, which is very, very high, and it's well deserved, I think. It's a high adult fantasy, and while it seems complicated, it's very easily palpable to readers, so I think it's got a high rating because a lot of people can pick it up and give it a shot. Even if it does seem intimidating by its length, it's really easy to get through, and it's one of my favorites that I've reread, so I do agree with that one. The next one though is one that I do not agree with, and that is volume 1 of Monster, and this is another manga series, and it follows a guy who I think is a doctor, and there is also a serial killer, and this doctor knows that this guy is a murderer, but the police don't realize that this guy is a murderer, and so the doctor leaves his job and tries to track this guy down. So it's kind of like a psychological cat and mouse game, and it's been compared to Death Note, which is one of my favorite mangas ever, which is also a psychological murder mystery cat and mouse game, but this one didn't pull it off as well as Death Note did, and I got a few volumes in and it felt like it was coasting to me, and I wasn't as interested. So while Goodreads gave this a rating of 4.55, I gave it a 3 stars, so I disagree with this one. Up next, we've got Heartstopper Volume 1, and I already mentioned Heartstopper Volume 4 being quite high up on this list. Heartstopper Volume 1, though, is rated at 4.54 stars, so it's still very highly and well received. So yes, tick, I definitely support that one. We've also got The Name of the Wind, which is a quintessential fantasy book for all of those adult fantasy readers. This is a very lyrical story and it's one perspective character, so I can see why this is very highly rated, and it's been around for a decade. There is so much hype for this, and I stand on board with that. I love this book, but I also know that it's got its problems. But when I look at this book, I just see my nostalgia, I see the lyrical writing, I listen to the brilliant performance of the audiobook, so those things don't necessarily override the bad things in the book, but the reading experience and the nostalgia helps me deal with the negativity about this. So I would rate this a 5 stars, and Goodreads, my notes tell me, rate this a 4.52. So this is still highly received, and I agree with the hype here. I would 100% reread this book and I would recommend it to people. So Goodreads has got something right. Then we've got a Brandon Sanderson one, again, which is not unexpected, but what surprised me was that it's the Arcanum Unbounded collection, which is the collection of short stories. Although, because Brandon Sanderson writes the Cosmere universe, which is kind of like his version of the MCU, it's all of his characters in the same universe but on different planets. Those are all short stories in Arcanum Unbounded that are on different planets, so they relate to his current book series already, like Stormlight and Mistborn and Warbreaker and Elantris. So because it relates to those other stories, I think that's what kind of gave it a bit of a boost. And I would disagree with the high rating. I think Arcanum for me is like a 3.5 stars. There were some stories in there that were amazing, but there were other stories in there that I just found weird or alienating. I didn't like them. So I don't necessarily agree with the rating that Goodreads gave, which is a 4.5. I would give it a solid 3.5, which is an entire rating below. Then we've got The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I really enjoyed this book, although this is rated at 4.5 stars and I'd probably give it a 4 looking back. I think it's just because of the tone of voice, because I'm very adult now compared to the audience it's aimed for, so my enjoyment level is not the same, but my appreciation of the themes and what it's giving commentary on I think is amazing. So in that regard, I think the rating is very well deserved, but I just, from an enjoyment perspective, gave it about a 4, which is still pretty good. So it sits at 4.5. It's been read by a lot of people, which is an excellent thing, and I think there's a movie actually, and I haven't seen it yet, so that's kind of shame on me, but it was a really great book, a great YA book, and I remember Angie Thomas coming out to Australia and I got to meet her, so that was pretty cool too. So The Hate You Give, I would definitely agree that it deserves that high up spot. But then shortly after that is another Brandon Sanderson, but nobody's really surprised because his books are so popular, and that is Skyward. And I loved Skyward. I gave it 5 stars, so I definitely agree with the 4.5 it's got over Goodreads, but I'm disappointed with the rest of the series. It's not been quite as good as Skyward for me. So it really started strong and then it changed, obviously, with the sequels, because naturally a series has to change, but it wasn't the change I wanted necessarily. So it was great, but Skyward is my favourite of the series. And then we've got Six of Crows, which is sitting at 4.49. And then shortly after that, we've got Evelyn Hugo, which is 4.48. I loved both of these, but I think from memory, I listened to both of them on audiobook, interestingly enough, but Evelyn Hugo I'd probably give a little bit less than the Goodreads rating. Everyone raved about it so much that the hype brought up my expectations in a massive way. And when I read it, I was really captivated by it and I liked the ending of it, but I don't think it's as much of a game changer book to me as, not necessarily Six of Crows, but as the rating on Goodreads tells you. So it was a great book, but not like a blasted into my favorites kind of thing. And that's what I'd probably give a 4.5, 4.4 to 5-star rating for. So it deserves its 4 stars. It was excellent. And then Six of Crows also, I think I gave that 5 stars actually, but that's because I listened to it on audiobook, and that audiobook had 6 different narrators based on the 6 different main characters. And because it had all of those different voices, that really added to the experience of reading it. So if I hadn't listened to the audiobook, I'd probably give it about a 4.5 stars, so pretty much the same as Goodreads. But because I listened to the audiobook and I listened to it a few years ago now, I gave it a 5. My ratings have changed now. I've become a little bit more critical, but I still really enjoyed Six of Crows too. And then nobody is surprised that another Brandon Sanderson is on this list, and this is The Final Empire, the first Mistborn book, and Goodreads gave this one a 4.46. I would give it a little bit of a higher rating based on what I said in my review. I gave this a 5 stars, but the first time I read this, I gave it a 4. So this series really grew for me. I gave 4, 4.5, and then 5. So if you're reading Mistborn, it definitely gets better, and then even upon reread, it gets even better, because without hesitation, I gave this a 5 on my reread. So I would agree and then escalate Goodreads to say, this is actually better on the second time around. I would tentatively agree with the 4.46 rating, or 4.4 whatever it was. Yes, 4.46 rating. And now the last 2 that I also have highly rated on Goodreads are 2 manga actually. So Death Note Volume 1, which I mentioned before as a kind of comparative to Monster Volume 1, which was a cat and mouse kind of game. Death Note is a cat and mouse game as well, and it's about a guy named Light Yagami, and he one day finds a note on the ground, like a notebook, and he opens it and it's got instructions in it, and those instructions detail how to kill people based on what you write in the book. And the book actually belongs to a Shinigami, which is a death god. So the death god was bored one day, dropped the death note, and then Light found it, and now Light has taken it upon himself to kill off all the criminals, to, I guess, exact revenge and justice. But in doing that, does he become the villain because he's become what he's doing? Like he's become who he's killing, essentially. And so he's getting tracked down by this guy named L. And what Light needs to kill people are a name, a full name, and a face. And L doesn't show his face and he doesn't share his full name. So it becomes a cat and mouse game between these two characters about Light trying to kill all the criminals and avoid being investigated by L. So I loved Death Note and I would highly agree with the rating on there. I haven't reread it in a very long time, but I have a lot of nostalgia for it, and the Japanese live action movies are pretty close to the actual anime and the manga. So I would highly recommend those as well. Not the American versions, because I think they were remade with an English or US cast. I have not touched those because those adaptations are usually pretty terrible, but the manga and the anime and the Japanese live action were actually pretty spot on. But as far as Goodreads goes, 4.46 was the rating. It was quite up there, and I think I'd probably give Death Note a 4 to 5 stars. Like it would be solidly in that bracket. So I would agree with that. And then the last one is also a manga, and that is A Silent Voice. And I think this is about a deaf girl who gets bullied at school, and the bully realizing later on that he was really nasty to her and trying to make amends. And it was quite heartfelt and it built up the characters quite well. And I think I gave it 4. So I gave it just under what Goodreads has given it, but I would agree with that rating as well. So let me know if you have read any of these. I'd be interested to find out. There was a surprising amount of manga on here that I didn't expect many other people to have read necessarily, because when I think about Goodreads, I think mostly about science fiction and fantasy books or popular romance books or popular YA. So it's cool to see all of these high ratings from bigger audiences from manga. So that is the end of the video. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if your ratings differ to mine. I would really be interested to find out. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. I'll come chat with you down below and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.